I never imagined my life would take the course it did. Even now, when I look back, I find myself wondering how one moment led to another, how a series of seemingly insignificant events shaped everything that followed. My name is Clara, and this is my story. For nearly 10 years, I had been married to my husband, Nick. Ours was not a whirlwind romance but rather a partnership built on mutual respect and companionship. We met through family introductions, shared a brief courtship, and soon after, we were married. Nick had always been a responsible and hardworking man. His dedication to his career ensured that we never lacked financial stability, and I appreciated him for it. Our life together was structured and predictable. We had a comfortable home, an established routine, and no major conflicts. But over time, the spark between us slowly faded. We were more like two individuals coexisting under the same roof than a couple deeply in love. Conversations dwindled to mere necessities, and affection became a distant memory. I reassured myself that this was just the natural course of marriage, that love simply evolved. With Nick consumed by work, I spent my days managing the household, keeping things in order. It was a stable life, one that offered little in the way of surprises. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't truly happy either. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that stability alone was enough. Then, about a year ago, we hired a new house helper, Kabir. He was a young man in his mid-20s, quiet and diligent, with a strong work ethic. Having come from a small town in search of better opportunities, he was respectful and efficient, quickly proving to be a reliable presence in our home. At first, my interactions with him were minimal. I would give instructions, and he would follow them without question. He wasn't one for unnecessary conversation, and I preferred it that way. But over time, I began noticing the small details about him. Unlike many others in his position, he took genuine pride in his work. He ensured that everything in the house was always in perfect order, often fixing minor problems before I even had the chance to notice them. His attentiveness extended beyond his duties. He treated the house and everything in it with care. One evening, as I struggled to lift a heavy box in the storeroom, Kabir walked in. Without a word, he stepped forward and took it from my hands. "I'll handle it, ma'am," he said simply. I wasn't sure why that moment stayed with me, but it did. Perhaps it was because I had grown so used to managing things on my own that I was no longer accustomed to someone noticing my struggles. Nick had always been preoccupied, and over the years, I had learned not to expect help. But Kabir's small act of consideration felt different. As the weeks passed, I became more aware of the little things he did. He was observant in a way I hadn't expected. If I was feeling unwell, he would subtly adjust the day's routine to make things easier for me. If I misplaced something, he would quietly find it and leave it in an obvious spot for me to see. He never overstepped his role, yet his presence made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as I sorted through old photo albums, Kabir was dusting a nearby shelf. He glanced at the pictures and offered a faint smile. "You look happy in these, ma'am," he remarked. I turned my gaze to the images, snapshots from the early years of my marriage, vacations, celebrations. I did look happy. Or at least, happier than I felt now. I hadn't realized just how much I had changed. "I suppose I was," I admitted softly. That was the first real conversation we had. From then on, our interactions became more natural. I found myself asking him about his life, his family, his hometown, his struggles. He answered honestly but never in excess, sharing glimpses of a world so different from mine. Despite the hardships he had faced, he remained kind and hardworking. One evening, as I sat alone on the balcony watching the sunset, Kabir passed by. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Would you like some tea, ma'am?" I nodded, and a few minutes later, he returned with a cup. But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood at a respectful distance, his eyes also drawn to the sky. "It's peaceful here," he murmured. I looked at him, surprised. "Yes, it is." For the first time in a long while, I felt like someone was sharing a moment with me, not just existing in the same space but truly sharing it. As days turned into weeks, our conversations became more frequent. They never crossed any lines, never strayed into anything inappropriate, yet they meant something. They reminded me of what it felt like to be listened to have someone pay attention to the small things. Then one morning, I found myself in a strangely restless mood. Nick had left early for work, barely acknowledging me as he walked out the door. The house felt empty, suffocating in its silence. I tried to distract myself with chores, but my thoughts refused to settle. Kabir must have noticed because, after a long pause, he quietly asked, "Is everything all right, ma'am?" His question was simple, but it caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in a long time. I looked at him, debating whether to brush it off. But before I could stop myself, I sighed and admitted, "I don't know." He didn't pry or ask for explanations. He simply nodded, as if he understood. And somehow, that made all the difference. That moment marked the beginning of something I couldn't quite define at the time. It wasn't love, nor was it an affair in the conventional sense. But it was significant. It was a connection, a presence I hadn't felt in years. Then, one evening, Nick came home earlier than usual. I was sitting in the living room, lost in thought, when he walked in. He looked exhausted, as always, but there was something different in his expression. "I was thinking," he said, loosening his tie. "Maybe we should take a short trip somewhere. Just the two of us." I blinked in surprise. In all these years, he had never suggested anything like this. "A trip?" I echoed, unsure if I had heard correctly. He nodded. "Yes. I know I've been busy, and we hardly spend time together anymore. But I think we need this." His words struck something deep inside me. For so long, I had believed that Nick had stopped caring. But maybe he had been struggling too. Maybe he had noticed the distance between us and simply hadn't known how to bridge it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words in my mind, the way he had looked at me, as if he was afraid of losing something he hadn't even realized was slipping away. And then there was Kabir. The next morning, I found Kabir in the garden, tending to the plants. "I need to talk to you," I said. He wiped his hands and straightened. "Of course, ma'am." I hesitated, then forced myself to speak. "Kabir, I just want to thank you for everything. You've been a great help in this house, and I truly appreciate it." He met my gaze, sensing there was more. I took a deep breath. "But I think it's best if we maintain some distance. I don't want there to be any misunderstandings." For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, a quiet understanding, tinged with sadness. "I understand, ma'am," he said simply. And that was that. Nick and I went on that trip, and for the first time in years, we talked. Really talked. It wasn't a magical fix, and it didn't mend everything overnight. But it was a beginning. The trip was supposed to be a fresh start. That's what I told myself as Nick and I packed our bags, booked the tickets, and set out for a quiet retreat in the mountains. The air was crisp, the scenery breathtaking, and for the first time in years, we were away from the suffocating routine of home. At first, it felt strange to be alone with him like this, without the usual distractions. There was no office for him to disappear into, no housework for me to busy myself with, just the two of us in a place that neither of us had any attachment to. It forced us to interact in ways we hadn't in a long time. The first few days were light-hearted, small conversations over breakfast, walks through winding forest paths, quiet moments watching the sunrise from the balcony of our cabin. It felt like we were trying to remember how to be around each other without the weight of everyday obligations pressing down on us. But even in those moments, I felt it, this emptiness inside me that I couldn't name, a hollow space that even Nick's efforts couldn't fill. He was trying, I could see that. He would reach for my hand while we walked, he would ask me what I was thinking, he would lean in just a little closer than usual when we sat together in the evening with cups of tea. And I responded, because that's what I was supposed to do. I smiled, I talked, I reached back, but it all felt mechanical. Like I was playing the role of a wife who was reconnecting with her husband, rather than actually feeling it. At night, when we lay side by side in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, I would close my eyes and wait for sleep to take me, but it never came easily. My mind would wander, drifting back to things I didn't want to think about. To things I had promised myself I would leave behind. To the quiet presence of someone who had never once demanded anything from me, yet had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing. Kabir's voice, his steady hands, the way he had noticed things about me without me ever having to say a word. The memory of the way he had stood beside me on the balcony, not saying much, just sharing the silence, made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't understand. I told myself it was nothing. That it was just a passing thought, a lingering attachment to something that had simply been a reminder of what I had once wanted from my marriage. But the truth was, it wasn't going away. It was growing, curling its way into the spaces of my mind that should have been focused on my husband, on this trip, on the life I was supposed to be mending. By the time we returned home, I was exhausted. Not from the trip itself, but from the weight of pretending that everything had changed when, deep down, I knew it hadn't. The routine settled back and almost immediately, Nick went back to work, falling into the same pattern of long hours and late nights. The house was as it had always been, silent, predictable, empty in a way that had nothing to do with space. And then there was Kabir. I avoided him at first. It was ridiculous, but I did. I made sure I wasn't in the same room when he was cleaning, I kept my distance, I buried myself in small tasks just to keep my mind from wandering where it wasn't supposed to go. But it didn't matter. Because the moment I saw him again, everything I had been trying to suppress came crashing back. He didn't act any differently. He was the same as always, quiet, respectful, going about his duties without any indication that anything had changed. But something had changed. It was me. I started noticing him even more than before, in ways I hadn't let myself fully acknowledge. The way he moved, the quiet efficiency of his work, the way his shirt clung slightly to his back when he carried something heavy. The way his eyes would flicker towards me sometimes, unreadable yet lingering just long enough to make my pulse stutter. I hated myself for it. Hated the way my stomach tightened when he walked past, the way my skin prickled with awareness when he was near. This wasn't supposed to happen. I had told myself I was past this, that the trip had been a reset, that I was committed to making things work with Nick. And yet, here I was, standing in the middle of my own home, heart racing over the presence of someone I had no right to think about like this. I tried to convince myself that it was just loneliness playing tricks on me. That it wasn't Kabir himself, but what he represented, the attention, the quiet understanding, the feeling of being seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It wasn't just about longing for connection. It was about him. The worst part was that he never did anything to encourage it. Not once. He never stepped over any lines, never gave any indication that he saw me as anything more than the woman he worked for. And that should have made it easier, should have given me the clarity I needed to move on. But instead, it made it worse. Because it meant that every stolen glance, every skipped heartbeat, every moment of lingering awareness was entirely my own doing. I was the one who couldn't let it go. I was the one who wanted something more. And that realization terrified me. The days blurred together in a haze of routine and restraint. I threw myself into the structure of my life, forcing myself to be the wife I was supposed to be. The vacation had given me and Nick a temporary closeness, but like a tide retreating from the shore, it faded as soon as we stepped back into our daily lives. He was back to leaving early, coming home late, his presence more of an afterthought than a constant. And I told myself that was fine, that this was what I had chosen, that a decade of marriage couldn't suddenly be rewritten just because I had spent a few weeks feeling seen by someone else. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the thoughts refused to leave. It wasn't just Kabir's presence in the house that unsettled me, it was the absence of something in my own life that I couldn't ignore anymore. It was in the way I lingered in rooms after he had been there, catching the faintest trace of his scent before it disappeared. It was in the way my pulse quickened when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. It was in the way I caught myself staring when he wasn't looking, memorizing details I had no right to focus on. I told myself it was just an infatuation, an emotional distraction that would pass if I ignored it long enough. So I did. I avoided unnecessary interactions, kept my tone neutral, made sure to never be alone with him for too long. But avoidance only made it worse. The less I saw of him, the more he occupied my mind, filling the quiet moments that should have belonged to my husband. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I felt it like a current beneath the surface. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, when I felt the weight of someone's gaze on me. I turned instinctively, my breath catching in my throat when I realized it was Kabir. He wasn't looking at me the way he usually did, his expression wasn't neutral, wasn't distant. It was something else, something unreadable, something that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't understand. I should have looked away, should have pretended I hadn't noticed, but I didn't. I held his gaze for just a second too long, just enough for the moment to stretch between us, charged with something neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. And then it was gone. He turned away, went back to his work, and I was left standing there, gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying that brief moment over and over. It was nothing. And yet, it was everything. Because for the first time, I wasn't just fighting my own thoughts, I was fighting the possibility that I wasn't the only one feeling this. The days that followed were unbearable. Every interaction felt loaded, every glance stretched longer than it should have, every accidental touch sent a bolt of electricity through my veins. And the worst part? He still never crossed the line. He was as respectful as ever, as distant as ever, yet I could feel it in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I told myself I needed to get away. Distance was the only answer. So, I started leaving the house more often, finding errands to run that I normally wouldn't have bothered with. I spent longer at the grocery store, took unnecessary trips to the tailor, visited my sister even when I had nothing to say. Anything to create space. But it didn't matter. Because no matter how far I went, I always came back home. And home meant facing him. Then, one evening, something happened that shattered my carefully built restraint. A storm had rolled in unexpectedly, heavy rain pounding against the windows, thunder shaking the walls. I was in the living room, staring at the downpour, when the lights flickered and cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the house, sudden and complete. I stood there, frozen for a moment, before my pulse started hammering in my ears. I wasn't afraid of the dark, but there was something unnerving about the way the house fell silent, the usual hum of electricity replaced by the sound of rain and my own breathing. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, steady, approaching. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned, barely able to make out the shadow moving toward me. My breath caught when I realized who it was. Kabir. He stopped a few feet away, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the windows. I could see the outline of him, the rise and fall of his chest, the way he hesitated like he was debating whether to say something. And that was the moment I knew. I had been fooling myself. This wasn't just an infatuation. It wasn't just loneliness. It was something real, something I had been denying for far too long. And worst of all, I didn't want to fight it anymore.